So today in our scripture readings, we've met Moses as he is shepherding sheep in the wilderness, and he's turned aside from the path that he planned to take because he spotted a miracle, a bush that appears to be on fire but was not consumed. And that place, as it turns out, marked holy ground. For in that place, Moses encountered the voice of the divine. But I want to back up just a little bit in the story, because Moses was approaching that place that day, that place that turned out to be a holy place, and I expect he had some questions burning deep in his heart. And I suspect he'd been carrying these questions for many years. Moses, after all, is a Hebrew, but he was raised in an Egyptian court. And although he had to spend most of his formative years hiding his true identity in the court of the Egyptian Pharaoh, so Moses carried the burden of his people. He was haunted by their story. The people came to the land of Egypt through the journeys of Joseph, the son of Jacob, who was later called Israel, the son of Isaac, the one who laughs, the son of Abraham. And Moses comes from a people who have this legacy of a promise from God, a promise that they carried in their hearts and in their dreams for many years. It was a 3-part promise that God made to Abraham. So maybe God was a Baptist, I'm not sure. But the first is that he would have land. Now the people are still waiting on this one. They do not have a land of their own. And the second is that Abraham would become the ancestor of a great people. Now that they have come to Egypt, this has actually begun to happen. The sons and daughters of Israel have become exceedingly fruitful, multiplying greatly and increasing in number, so the land was filled with them. However, as the memory of Joseph passed away, the sheer numbers of this people began to prick fear into the heart of Pharaoh. And so at first he oppressed and enslaved them. And then when that didn't work, he began to work them harder and harder until they were working harder than they ever had before. And then when that didn't do the trick, Pharaoh, and this is something Moses knows all too well from his own personal story, found increasingly violent ways to wipe the Hebrew people from the land of Egypt. The sons and daughters of Israel, who are God's people, are suffering so much they have begun to cry out to God in prayer. The world is a difficult place, and it is only getting worse. And everyone, Moses included, is probably wondering where God is in all this suffering. Because the third promise that God made to Abraham is that the entire world was going to be blessed through these people. But who in the whole world is blessed when any of God's children are oppressed? Is God going to remain faithful to this promise, Moses wonders. Perhaps Moses has been asking himself if God is really real, or if God is real, does God actually care? When you look around at the reality of the situation, people being crushed under unbearable working conditions, and Pharaoh growing crueler as time goes on, and there's no relief in sight, where in the world is God? And the answer to the questions that Moses carries in his heart is going to involve him. When Moses turns aside from the sight of that remarkable bush that burned but was not consumed, here is the word that God speaks to him from that holy ground. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt, and now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go, he says, I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. So God is indeed a God who sees. God is a God who hears the cries of the people, and God intends to do something about this suffering. It involves sending Moses. Now Moses has questions. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? Moses asks, first of all. And to answer that question, we have to understand what happened in Genesis chapter 1, which is why I read part of that to you as well. You see, Moses is a special person, as it turns out, uniquely situated to go and do what God is sending him to do. But this is because God has already been active in Moses' story. God has already been answering the question that Moses carries in his heart and on his mind about where God is in the face of suffering and oppression, long before Moses even came to the scene. So the first answer to the question that Moses carries involves two women whose names are Shiphrah and Puah. These are midwives who serve the Hebrew people by attending their births. And when Pharaoh saw that the Hebrew people were flourishing and multiplying under the yoke of slavery, rather than being ground into dust as he hoped they would be, he had to come up with another plan. And this plan was to ask the midwives to murder all of the male children as soon as they entered the world, although Pharaoh grants that the girls might live, because apparently Pharaoh is not all that concerned that girls or women are much of a threat to him. However, the very first mention of God in the book of Exodus is this. The midwives, however, feared God, and they did not do what the king of Egypt told them to do. They let the boys live. So God is at work in this story through the hands of Shiphrah and Puah because they fear God, which means they know to whom they owe their ultimate allegiance. And the nameless, did you notice that? Pharaoh is nameless. The nameless Pharaoh can bluster and he can threaten all he wants, but Shiphrah and Puah know in their heart of hearts that what Pharaoh has ordered them to do is wrong, and they refuse to carry out this evil. And they don't even really make a big show of it. There's not a lot of pomp and circumstance. They just refuse Pharaoh's orders. They do not get on board with his evil and violent intentions, which put Pharaoh at odds with the living God of the Hebrew people. And Pharaoh doesn't even seem to realize it at first. We don't know how much time passes between the time that he first gave the order and the time that he managed to do the math and run the numbers and realize that there was not, in fact, a decrease in the number of Israelites, but they've continued to grow in number. But when he does realize it, he calls these two women on the mat and asks them why they failed to carry out their orders. And these women, who apparently are quick on their feet as well as a study in courage, tell Pharaoh that the Hebrew people are so lively or hardy or vigorous that they can birth a baby before the midwife even steps over the threshold. There's a subtle insult going on in the Hebrew language here. Because there's a connection between that word that's translated vigorous, lively, or hardy, and the Hebrew word for animal. Pharaoh already believes that the Hebrew people are little better than animals. And in our day, we've seen the harm that is permitted when a powerful person declares that other people are something like animals. Shiphrah and Puah may be trying to keep Pharaoh's favor by playing into this pre-existing prejudice that he demonstrates. What can we possibly do with these people, they ask Pharaoh. They give birth with animalistic vigor, they shrug. So Shiphrah and Puah say no to Pharaoh's violent tendencies and the unjust order that they have simply been given. And they're not trying to do anything grand or amazing. They're being faithful to the call of their hearts, to the whisper of their conscience, to their understanding of the nature of the God of creation who values life. Here they stand and they can do no other. And so Pharaoh's plan B to solve the Hebrew problem is thwarted. So who is Moses that he should go to Pharaoh? He is one of the perhaps legions of babies who were saved through the resistance of Shiphrah and Puah, two women that Pharaoh discounted as being mere subjects of his will, who were obligated to follow his commands, he thinks, but who follow their higher allegiance to the God of life instead. So perhaps we should not underestimate what a small number of people, of committed individuals, can do when they align themselves with the God of life. But there are others in this story through whom God was working for the suffering people. After this, Pharaoh extended the orders that he gave to Shiphrah and Puah, those brave midwives, and this time he insisted that any Egyptian who saw a son belonging to the people of Israel was to drown that child in the Nile. And so this time God acted through Moses' mother. Her name is Jochebed, but we don't learn that until later on in the story. And also through his sister, whose name is Miriam. Moses' mother hid Moses for as long as she could, but when it was no longer possible to hide this growing infant, she took even more drastic action. In one sense, she's actually doing what Pharaoh ordered everyone to do. She puts her beloved baby boy into the Nile River, only she sends him in his own little ark, basket, or boat to preserve his life. And then, after Jochebed whispers her prayers of protection over the little ark, perhaps turning away to hide her tears as she tips this little vessel into the mighty river, Miriam takes over. Miriam followed that little basket and watched it as it traveled down the river, lest it take on water or get disturbed by an animal as the boat settled into the river's current. And Miriam never lets this baby out of her sight until she can be assured of Moses' safety. And there's still more. When Jochebed and Miriam had done the best they could, their actions on their own would have held little power, because Hebrew women can only do so much in the oppressive Pharaoh's regime. But then God slips into the story one more time, and this time works through another woman, the woman that Moses would end up calling mother, a daughter of Pharaoh, a princess of Egypt, who sees this little life preserver there in the Nile. She draws aside to see what this could possibly be and opens it to find a squalling infant staring her in the face. Now, the fact that this woman is an Egyptian princess does not automatically mean that she is all that powerful either. Pharaoh may have had a harem of many wives, and children may have been born to these women all the time. So the lives of boys were valued over the lives of girls. And so although this woman is indeed a daughter of Pharaoh, she could easily be as voiceless as Jochebed and Miriam were. And yet, despite this, she decides, instead of reacting out of fear, instead of worrying about what her father, the Pharaoh, the king, the ruler would think or do if he finds out that she is harboring a baby of the fugitive race, she has compassion on this little child and takes him into her home and raises him on her own. And then Miriam, who's Moses' ever-resourceful sister, and that's something Moses is going to learn about later, for Miriam actually also helps Moses take leadership of the people of Israel into the desert. But after she sees that the infant Moses is delivered safely into the care of Pharaoh's daughter, she comes out of wherever she was hiding and she offers the services of her mother as a wet nurse so that Moses' own mother could whisper into his ear, could sing him to sleep with the songs of the Hebrew people, the songs and history that Moses carries in his heart, even as he herds sheep in the wilderness, even as he approaches that holy place with questions and with cares, the songs that the intervening years in the Egyptian court could never wash away. So God sent Moses into the world uniquely positioned for this role as he grew up the child of two separate worlds, the child of a Hebrew mother and adopted by an Egyptian princess. Moses was positioned for greatness, but in order for him to get there, God worked through not one, but 5 different women. Women who appear powerless, women who are of little account, women who are dismissed and underestimated. And yet God worked through and with these 5 women to shame the strong and to overthrow the tyrant Pharaoh. And so if you have ever felt yourself to be insignificant, like you can't do much of anything in the world, or if you have carried similar questions in your heart to the ones that Moses carries as he wanders in the wilderness, about where God could possibly be found in a world of sorrow and suffering, or if you find yourself up against something that just seems too strong, that you think you could never prevail or make a difference, maybe remember these 5 women, Shiphrah, Puah, Jochebed, Miriam, and the Egyptian princess, who is unnamed. They may not have had any sense that what they were doing was changing the world, or that they were God's answer to the questions that the people have been asking, and they were the answers to the prayers the hurting people barely dared to utter. But God worked through these 5 unlikely women. God can work with and through you too. It reminded me of the words of a speaker I heard at a recent conference I attended, who said, "You are so courageous to look the world in the face with all your hard-won scars, whether they are visible or invisible, and to make your stand for goodness and possibility, wonder and curiosity, for belonging and for healing. Don't you see how brave and beautiful you are?" The small and powerless women in this story look the world in the face. They make their stand. They love the baby, or babies in the case of Shiphrah and Puah, right in front of them. And through their bravery, God shapes Moses, who's going to lead God's people for many years to come. Who am I is the first question Moses asks. And he asks a second question after that. The second one is this: suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, "The God of your father sent me to you," and they ask me, "What is his name?" Then what should I tell them? In other words, Moses, after asking, "Who am I?" says, "And who are you?" And the answer that Moses received is far more complicated and wonderful than he could have known. There are many ways to translate the name that God gives to Moses. I have an entire page of them written down somewhere. If you come to our Bible study Friday or next Thursday, you might hear them. But some of the possible ones are: I am who I am that I will be what I will be, I am what I will be. The exact meaning of the divine name, however, has caused enough ink to be spilled to fill, well, perhaps the entire Nile River. But the name that God gives to Moses also gives him the answer to his question, the one that was weighing down his heart and had driven him into the wilderness in the first place. You see, the name that God gave to Moses has a past sense. This is the God of your ancestors. God is reassuring Moses that God has been with the people all throughout their past. From the minute God called Abraham, God has never stopped walking with the people. So there's a past sense to these words. There's also a future tense to these words, which means that God intends to stay with this people throughout the long journey that they would undertake next in the story. And God intends to stay with Moses as well throughout the challenges that he will have as he leads the people into their future. And perhaps most importantly, God's name reveals that he has compassion on his people, and that he desires a relationship with them right here, right now, in the present, even though they are in the messy middle of their suffering and their pain as they cry out to God for help and relief. So when God gives this name to Moses, it's so that Moses and everyone else who comes with him and everyone else who comes after him will know who to call on, because this is the God who cares enough about our pain to respond. In the words of one writer, there is no path that love won't travel to see you and this world restored. Now Moses, it was estimated, was around 80 years of age the day he went walking in the wilderness, going about his job as a shepherd, when God got his attention and he turned aside in curiosity at this bush that burned with fire but was not consumed. God heard the questions that Moses carried, just as God hears and sees the suffering of the people. And in response, God sent Moses. The last, best, and only hope for this hurting world has always been people who love God so much that they love their neighbor, who dare to love the person right in front of them, who take seriously God's instructions, and who go. And as he goes about this enormous task, Moses is reminded that he will find that the God who has been faithful in the past and who is present to him right here and right now will also be with him into the future, no matter where this road takes him. And that is still true for you today. Would you bow with me in a word of prayer? God of deliverance, you called Shiphrah, Puah, Jochebed, Miriam, and Egyptian princes, and Moses, to be your hands, your feet, your voice in a troubled world. In the same way, we ask that you would teach us how to work, walk, and speak your word to this troubled world. Amen. As you go from this place today, pay attention to who and what God has placed in or near your path. May you remember the story God has been telling. May you see the image of God in each face. May you find the space to turn aside and see God at work. And may you know the blessing of God's presence each and every moment until we meet again. Amen. Go in peace.